Welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast. Operation Epic Fury is now officially in the third month. This limited operation that was supposed to be over in a few days drags on, and we see less and less coverage each passing day on the mainstream media. But here at Bring Our Troops Home, we will not stop talking about this until it's over and we have brought our troops home. Now, today's episode is more narrowly focused than the Iran war in general, and I don't know any other way to get into it other than to just start with this clip.
You want to hear an interesting coincidence? I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but on 9/11, on the actual day, September 11th, there were 4 planes. 2 hit the World Trade Centers, 1 hits the Pentagon. The 4th, which was late, Flight 93, wound up crashing in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We know that the vice president gave an order to shoot that plane down because, understandably, by the way, believed it was headed into Washington, which I think it was.
Yes.
4 American fighter jets were scrambled from D.C., chased that plane, and the story was, their explanation was, we didn't get there in time, and the plane was brought down instead by Todd Beamer and the other passengers, famously. Of those 4 fighter jets, of the pilots of those 4 fighter jets, they were National Guard pilots, 2 became generals.
Wow.
And one of them is Dan Caine.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's not widely known, but it's a fact.
Wow.
What are the odds of that?
Not good.
I don't know anything beyond what I just said, but I just think that's such an interesting fact.
All right, my brain melted just a little bit, and I'm still to this day trying to process what I just heard. I heard the words that they said, and I saw what they were saying, but I literally had to pull my truck over on the way home and sit and think for just a second about the implications of what I just heard. And I want you to think about what was just said as well. See, this is Tucker Carlson sitting across from John Kirkow, a former CIA officer who actually worked these type of problems for a living. Tucker drops a truth bomb, a fact that most people have never heard before. Now, I might be drawing a connection that really isn't there, but you can decide for yourself after I explain what went through my mind. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking uniformed officer of the United States military, General Dan Caine, on September 11th, 2001, was an Air National Guardsman, a fighter pilot, and he scrambled out of Andrews Air Force Base in an F-16. He was given the authority to put a missile through the civilian airliner full of Americans to keep it from hitting the Capitol. He was an Air National Guardsman. The same uniform 100,000 other Americans wear today while holding down their day jobs as plumbers or lawyers or teachers or firefighters and small business owners. And for a movement like ours, which is built around the National Guard and restraint of our foreign policy and around state sovereignty and around constitutional weight of who actually orders Americans into harm's way, the fact that the man at the very top of the American military comes from the Guard unit, that's no small detail, and it was one that I was completely unaware of. And there's a quote from the morning of 9/11. It hasn't been widely reported, but I was able to confirm it in multiple places, about Dick Cheney's order to shoot down a civilian airliner full of Americans. Major Dan Caine told his wingman, "Don't shoot anybody. I'll make that decision." I sat with that quote for quite a while because that's exactly the kind of caution that I would want and the type of leadership that I would want from a man with his finger on the trigger. I'd want him to have that kind of a mindset. He didn't want his wingman, a man that he would willingly lay his life down for, to have to live with the weight of putting a missile through the cockpit or through the plane of a bunch of Americans flying on a civilian airliner. He was telling his wingman that I'll carry that decision. I'm not going to put that on you. And if we have to do this terrible thing, I'll be the one who pulls the trigger. So for about a day after I heard Tucker say it, I let myself hope for a little bit. Maybe, just maybe, there was somebody in the room with the president now today who understands what war actually weighs. Somebody who, even without knowing it, was an unintentional ally of our movement. Somebody who had cautious restraint. Somebody whose first instinct wasn't an unauthorized, unconstitutional war of choice halfway around the world. So I started reading. And what I found is the story that I have to tell you tonight. But it's not the story that I wanted to find. It's the story that we all need to hear, because it tells you something about the system that no amount of honest individuals are going to fix. We start with who Dan Caine is. And I'm going to tell you what happened to him, and then I'm going to tell you about the man who refused to let it happen to him as well, because that man and we sat down and had a conversation about it last weekend at the Ron Paul Institute in Texas.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
All right, General John Daniel Caine. He was born in Elmira, New York in 1968. His father was also an Air Force fighter pilot who retired as a lieutenant colonel. Dan went to Virginia Military Institute. He played football for the cadets. He graduated in 1990 with a degree in economics, and then he joined the Air Force. By the morning of September 11th, 2001, he was a major. He was the chief weapons and tactics officer for the 121st Fighter Squadron, 113th Wing. He was in the District of Columbia Air National Guard. He flew F-16s out of Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington, D.C. Now, that's the unit that's responsible for defending the entire airspace over the capital of the United States, a National Guard unit, citizen soldiers. You all know the sequence of events that happened that morning. The first tower fell, and then the second tower, and then the Pentagon was a hit, and then a fourth aircraft, Flight 93, heading towards Washington with passengers on board, who then did the only thing that was left to be done. Major Caine and his wingman scrambled up out of Andrews Air Force Base under Dick Cheney's new unilateral escalated rules of engagement that may have required them to put a missile through a passenger jet full of Americans to keep it from hitting the Capitol. Caine, he understood the weight. The CIA's own published account of that day has Caine, after he received the order, saying, "That's me that will be doing the shooting." That's not a careerist mentality. It's not something that somebody that's been in the military for decades would say. That's not a chest puffer's sentence. He wasn't bragging about it. That's a statement from a man who understood the moral burden of potentially killing his own countrymen. That's the kind of moral seriousness you would want in a cockpit, in a war room, in the chairmanship of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, that major, he got promoted and he retired as a brigadier general, and then he came back to serve again. And in April of 2025, he was confirmed as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the first chairman ever drawn from the reserve component. The first chairman who never served at the rank of a 4-star general before being nominated. He was a guardsman in the most senior uniformed position in the United States military, a man who on September 11th told his wingman that I'll take the weight. That's who I thought I'd found when I heard Tucker. I thought I'd found an ally, somebody with the same mindset. And honestly, for about 24 hours, I was incredibly hopeful. Then I read the next chapter of the story. And the next chapter is one that nobody on Tucker's podcast actually talked about. That's fine. On February 23rd, 2026, Axios, they dropped a story citing two sources with knowledge of internal White House discussions on Iran. The story says that Chairman Caine had been advising the president and senior officials that a military campaign against Iran carries serious risks, entanglement, prolonged conflict, American casualties. One of the sources called him a reluctant warrior. I think that's a pretty fair title. Now, there's some important context here. Caine's not a dove. He's not reflexively opposed to using force. In fact, he'd been the architect and he was all in on the Venezuela operation that had captured Maduro just a few weeks earlier in January. He was specifically more cautious about Iran, though. The president pushed back on Truth Social the next day, and he said that the Axios story was, quote, 100% incorrect. He said Caine wanted peace, but believed that a war with Iran would be, quote, easily won. There's some of that Trump bluster. And for about a week, that was the public picture, a cautious chairman holding the line. And that's why I had hope. But here's what was happening behind the scenes during that exact same week. While we were all hopeful that there was restraint, something more sinister was happening behind closed doors. And the New York Times, they've now extensively reported on this. And the Jerusalem Post, the American Prospect, and others have since corroborated the story that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was preparing for a face-to-face meeting with President Trump. And that meeting, it happened on February 11th. It happened in the White House Situation Room. Netanyahu in person. Mossad director David Barnea, he was on the screen remotely. And I don't have to take you through that meeting in my own words. The man I just spent the weekend with at the Ron Paul Institute already did it for us, better than I ever could. Brian McGlinchey, he's an independent investigative journalist. He runs Stark Realities. And if you don't already follow him, you should. His social media handle, I believe, is @_Stark Realities on X. He's also a combat veteran. He's an Army military police. And before that, he was actually an enlisted infantryman in the Pennsylvania National Guard. Now he spends his time documenting the influence campaigns that drag this country into wars. He's been doing it for over 2 decades. Bring Our Troops Home. We owe actually Brian a tip of the hat and in our own gratitude, because back in 2021, he wrote an article about Defend the Guard that we put into our annual legislative packet. And this is the packet that we put into legislators' hands who agree to sponsor our bill. His words have been in the hands of state lawmakers for almost 6 years. And I owe that acknowledgement to him, and I owe him my own personal gratitude for his work. But here he is on stage at the Ron Paul Institute last weekend, describing the same Situation Room meeting that we just walked through a few moments ago.
In a mid-February briefing that will live in infamy, the Mossad told Trump that Iran's ballistic missile capability would be gone in a couple of weeks, that the Iranian people would rise up against the government, that Kurds in Iraq might come across the border and invade, opening up another front, that there was little chance Iran would be able to hit bases in nearby countries, U.S. bases, that Iran would be, get this, too weak to close the Strait of Hormuz. Thank you, vital intelligence partner and greatest ally in the region.
Listen to that. A briefing that will live in infamy. Brian's own words from the stage at the Ron Paul Institute in front of a room full of veterans who knew that he was telling the truth. Now, here's what Brian's speech did not have time to add. The piece that I want to put on the record tonight. The man that Mossad was working hardest to convince in that meeting, and the man that Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir, and Mossad Director David Barnea, and IDF Intelligence Chief Major General Shlomi Binder all came to Washington to lobby personally in the days leading up to that briefing was General Dan Caine. The Jerusalem Post reports it openly, and it says, quote, Zamir was very successful in bringing on board Caine and Cooper, and then indirectly Trump, in a sense of convincing them that the timing was right. And listen to that. Convincing Trump through Caine. Zamir convinced Caine. Caine then helped convince Trump. The chain of influence didn't run only Netanyahu through Witkoff through Trump, the chain that we documented last week in the Rish episode. There's also a parallel chain. It ran Zamir to Caine to Trump. The reluctant warrior of February 7th had become the war's chief military advocate by February 28th. And here's something that I have to add because I want this episode to be honest about the weight of evidence on both sides. That same Tucker Carlson episode I opened with, Tucker says that he heard nothing but superlatives about Caine from mutual friends. He hopes that the leaks that people were talking about Caine being this great guy, suggesting that he fought against this war from the beginning, are true. But then he says, and I'm paraphrasing, when it came down to it, General Caine did not say that the Iran war was a bad idea. Tucker wanted Caine to be the man that we both wanted him to be, but he wasn't. And so Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, 2026. The war is now in its 3rd month. And as of 2 weeks ago, Chairman Dan Caine, the same man who told his wingman in 2001 to let him carry the moral weight, went on the record again and he said this: we are ready to resume major combat operations against Iran in a moment's notice. He didn't say that we will do it if ordered. He didn't say that we are prepared in case the president decides. He said we're ready in a moment's notice. Eager tones, operational tempo words, the words of an institutional commander who has fully internalized the war as his own. The reluctant warrior was gone. He was reluctant for about 3 weeks. And the people who got him there were not Americans elected by Americans. They were the chief of staff of a foreign army, the head of a foreign intelligence service, and the head of a foreign spy agency. Now, I need to be careful here because I'm not saying that General Caine is a bad man. I've spent the last few weeks reading everything I could find about him, and I don't think it's true. What I am saying, though, is that General Caine is a converted or a captured man, and there's a difference. And the difference is exactly the same difference that I drew about Senator Jim Risch in the last episode. The system does not need bad men to make it work. It just needs to capture good men long enough. Now, I want to slow down for just a minute and tell you what this episode is really supposed to be about, because it's not really about Dan Caine. And it's not really about Joe Kent, the man that we covered in our last episode, the man whose name has become synonymous on this show for what happens when a serious veteran takes a serious oath seriously. We're going to come back to Joe in just a few minutes, and in his own words from stage, where he gave a speech at the Lake Jackson event that I talked about earlier. This episode is actually about the system that processed both Dan Caine and Joe Kent. Two warriors, same starting point. Caine, a Air National Guard pilot, carried the moral weight of a possible shoot down of his countrymen over Washington, D.C., knew what force and war costs to the human soul and psyche. He spent the next 20 years rising through the institutional ranks. And there's Joe Kent, Army Ranger Special Forces, CIA paramilitary officer, 11 combat deployments, Gold Star spouse who buried his wife in an undeclared war that Congress never voted for. He also knows what force costs. And he spent the rest of his career rising through the ranks of the military and then into the intelligence agencies. Both ended up in rooms where the most consequential decisions in American foreign policy get made. Both, in the days and weeks before the Iran war began, expressed serious doubts. Parallels are still there. Then, a sustained influence campaign, much of it run by foreign actors with their own national interests, went to work on both of them. You heard me right. They tried to influence Joe Kent and Dan Caine, both. One of them got worked over and got converted, and he stayed in the administration. The other one refused to be converted, and he walked out in protest. I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's wrong to change your mind when new information arrives. That's what serious people do. Joe Kent has changed his mind plenty of times. So have I. So have you. What I'm saying is something different. What I'm saying is that the system that surrounds the chairmanship of the Joint Chiefs is so heavily weighted towards conversion that even a man with Caine's biography, even a man whose career is bookended by the moral seriousness of September 11th being in that cockpit, got walked right over the line in a matter of weeks by foreign officials whose loyalties are not to the people of the United States. That's the system. That's what we're up against. And one of the speakers at the Ron Paul Institute last weekend named the alternative more clearly than I ever have. His name is Robert Pape. He's a professor at the University of Chicago. He runs the Chicago Project on Security and Threats, and he has spent his entire academic career documenting with hard data what works and what does not work in American foreign policy. Not a libertarian. He's not an America First. He's not MAGA. He's a serious empirical scholar who's advised every American president from George W. Bush to Joe Biden. That includes Trump 45. I want to be honest with you about Professor Pape before I play this next clip. Most of what he writes, most of what he argued in Lake Jackson, I actually agree with. I have his Substack pulled up on my phone half the time. It's called The Escalation Trap. And if you want serious analytical voice that is not part of any tribe, his work is some of the best in the country. But he and I don't agree on everything. And he laid out a 4-point alternative strategy in his speech that he calls offshore balancing. And I'm kind of lukewarm on parts of that prescription. And Joe Kent laid out a different alternative in his speech that he calls the third option. It's closer to a full diplomatic re-engagement with Iran, kind of like what we had before 1979. And I find myself more aligned with Joe than with Professor Pape on the way forward. But what Pape argued in Lake Jackson was hard to ignore. But here's what Pape and Kent and I and most of the people in our organization, we all agree on absolutely. The trajectory that we are on right now is a trap. The military-only answer is not an answer at all. And the principle that should be guiding American foreign policy is not the one that walked Dan Caine into that situation room in February. Here's the principle that Pape laid out in Lake Jackson. Check it out in his own words.
America's strategy has equated strength with intervention. This is a wrong assumption. We need a different principle, one that preserves America's power over time and does not ignore the mounting threats coming at us. And here's the core principle we should follow. It must be the policy of the United States to strengthen the economic foundations of its power at home and to use military force abroad only to prevent threats that cannot be contained by others. That is, I believe, the key principle. And that is how America builds peace and prosperity, how America can contain escalation in the Middle East, and how America can preserve our competitive edge.
I sure appreciate what Professor Pape just said. Strengthen the foundations at home. Use force abroad only when nobody else can contain the threat. It's not a slogan. It's not a catchphrase. That's just doctrine. And it's actually what America's actual security strategy used to look like before we became the world's hammer for hire. And it's a principle that if Dan Caine had been able to hold on to through that February meeting and that influence campaign, he would have changed the way he answered the question that the President of the United States asked him. Is the war in Iran a good idea? But Dan Caine couldn't hold on to that principle. But there is a man who could hold on to it, a man who did hold on to it all the way through a public resignation. Last week, I traveled to Lake Jackson, Texas with my beautiful wife, Andrea, to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. They hold a spring conference every year, and this year it was titled, and I kind of like the title, War is Back on the Menu. And on the stage, we saw Dr. Ron Paul himself, Dan McAdams, who runs the Institute, and who used to be Dr. Paul's Foreign Affairs and Intelligence Advisor on Capitol Hill back in the congressional days. Former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene was there. Whatever you think of her on other issues, she's been dead right on Iran when most of her Republican conference was wrong. She was right loudly. In fact, the President of the United States called her a traitor on Truth Social for being right on Iran and opposing him. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in the episode. Brian McGlinchey was there. Professor Pape was there. And one more person walked across that stage this year who had never been there before. It was Joe Kent. We all know the story. See, 2 months ago, Joe Kent, he was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and he had a Senate-confirmed role inside the executive branch. He was advising the president on exactly the type of questions that the conference we attended exists to discuss and debate. So his comments were well received, and he was definitely in a room of people that were very interested in hearing what he had to say. After Joe resigned, after the FBI reportedly was poking around his old phone records, after the President of the United States called him weak on security, after every cable network, including Mark Levin, called him an anti-Semite and a traitor, he didn't go into hiding. He went to Lake Jackson, Texas, and he walked onto that stage and he gave a speech. And then afterwards, he sat down with me for an interview, and I want to play you what he said in his own words and let it land with you directly. But a quick personal note before we go into Joe's speech, because I covered this in detail a few episodes ago in the Jim Risch episode, and I want to be transparent about it again here. Joe Kent is a friend. We've hunted geese together in Wyoming. We've sat at a bar talking about Article 1, congressional war powers, until they should have kicked us out for being so damn boring. In fact, here's a picture of Joe and Andrea and I at the Ron Paul Institute last Saturday after his speech. And I tell you all this not to name drop, not to try and sell anything that Joe's selling, but so that you know that my read on the man comes from something real. It's not from press clippings or cable news segment. What I know is that the person being called a traitor is one of the most principled people I've ever encountered in this fight. And that doesn't mean I agree with him on everything. And if I did, it'd be more of a fanboy relationship than a friendship. But it means that I can tell the difference between when a man is acting out of principle and when a man is acting out of politics. And what Joe did in resigning was principle. And I want to play you 2 moments from his speech, and they are both moments that, to my knowledge, have not been played widely anywhere else. The first one is about his wife, Shannon. Many of you know Shannon's name from our last episode. She was a Navy senior chief petty officer. She was a cryptologist, a technician, one of the most decorated of her kind in the Navy, and she was killed serving in Syria in January 2019 in an undeclared war that Congress never voted for. Their boys were 1 and 3 years old at the time. Joe stood on that stage in Lake Jackson and told the audience exactly when Shannon was killed. And I want you to listen carefully because this is a witness statement that everyone watching tonight should internalize and feel.
Tragically, I lost my late wife. She was also in the military. She joined right after 9/11. She's a native New Yorker. Her father and her uncle were both 9/11 Ground Zero first responders. And so her and her younger brother both joined the military right after that. She was killed in 2019, about a month after Trump tried to get us out of Syria the first time. So had Trump actually had the orders that President Trump gave been followed by the administrative state, the generals, the unelected bureaucrats, my late wife would still be alive to this day. And so that made me even more of a believer that we needed to have the right people in the right places. So
that is a Gold Star widower telling you on camera that his wife would still be alive. His sons would still have a mother if the administrative state had carried out the legal orders of the elected commander-in-chief. That's right. President Trump had ordered all American troops out of Syria, and he'd been told by his military advisors that that had been accomplished. And Shannon was killed. That's the same administrative state that allowed Dan Caine to be converted by a foreign government back in February. That's the same blob that walled off all dissenting views from the president as this Iran war was being assembled. And that's the same damn blob that Joe Kent walked out of 2 months ago rather than be a part of. Joe went on and he explained how the Iran war came together. The Israeli officials who came to brief American intelligence personally, the donor network with direct access to the president, the sophisticated media campaign through Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, the echo chamber he described in his resignation letter that we covered in detail in our last episode. I'm not going to replay that material tonight. If you missed the Rish episode, you can go back and watch it again. What I want to play for you next is something different. Something that Joe said near the end of his speech that I want every single person in this audience to internalize and think about carefully. Because in his passage, without ever using words that I would use, defend the guard, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center laid out an entire constitutional case supporting it. Check it out.
Issues, but after being in the executive branch for a brief period of time, I can tell you the reason why none of the domestic issues really get touched is because foreign policy is something the president controls completely. And it's much easier for a president to deal with foreign policy because in that realm, he doesn't really have to go to Congress. He should, but technically he should. However, he just doesn't have to. He doesn't have to deal with states. He doesn't have to deal with governors. So it's much easier for him to kind of be king of the world.
All right, did you catch that? He said that the president doesn't have to deal with the states. He doesn't have to deal with the governors. I want you to hear what Joe Kent just said, because you know why we don't have a completed wall on the southern border like we were promised? Do you know why we haven't mass deported 15 million illegal immigrants like we were promised? Do you know why the swamp hasn't been drained like we were promised? Because the president can't do any of that on his own. And the reason American presidents can drag this country into war after war after war in Iraq and Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and now Iran is because the only American institution currently that can stop him is Congress. And Congress, they've refused to act. But a little bit of effort, states, they can stop him. They can act. Governors can act. A governor who refuses to release their guard units to an unconstitutional war is exercising exactly the constitutional authority that the founders built into the system on purpose. Joe gave you the case for it more cleanly than any policy paper that I've ever read or written. After Joe finished his speech, we sat down for an interview, and the first question I asked him was about why he resigned publicly, why he didn't just quietly leave and the way that most people do when they hit their limit inside of the executive branch. And here's what he said.
And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your personal red line. At what point did President Trump, in the war with Iran, cross your red line and made you decide, I have to stand up publicly and say something?
I would say when we got into this second iteration, I was hoping that we'd be able to influence him from the inside to do something like we did with Midnight Hammer and just kind of walk it back and get back on a more pragmatic footing. But when I saw that the casualties starting to come in, That for me was like, this is going to keep going, and I can't be a part of this. I need to speak out to hopefully prevent more casualties from continuing to come in and to stop the bleeding, essentially.
That's the moment that Joe had to make a choice. Stay quiet, soldier on, and do the institutional thing, or speak out. Caine made the opposite choice between Zamir's first briefing and that Situation Room meeting. Kent made his decision when the casualties started coming in. Now, the second clip I want to show you from our interview is one that I want you to really digest and process, because every American who cares about constitutional war should hear this. I asked Joe Kent about state-level Defend the Guard legislation, about the work that this organization has been doing for years to give governors and state legislators the legal tool that they need to refuse to release National Guard units into wars that Congress has never authorized or voted for. The man who was running the National Counterterrorism Center 6 weeks ago answered my question. I want you to listen carefully.
As of today, 18 states, your state, Washington, my state, Idaho, are participating in the war in Iran. 18 states, National Guards. Most of them are air refueling assets. Arkansas sent the Green Berets, I think, out of the 19th group. Is that right? 19th group?
Yeah, sounds right, yeah.
So they're sending not just National Guard staff officers, they're sending people that are participating in the conflict. Pilots from Idaho flying their A-10s participating in the rescue operation of the weapons safety officer that was shot down. You've supported Defend the Guard in the past. You endorsed it early in your campaign.
Yeah.
Would starving the war machine of the bodies of the National Guard be a legitimate way to stop this overreaching federal bloodlust?
It'd be huge. I mean, because like the dirty secret of the war on terror, but really a lot of our enduring overseas deployments is we need the Guard to actually do those. When I was over in Syria as the National Counterterrorism Center director, I visited with the Iowa National Guard. They were running most of the operations inside of Syria. They were the ones who lost those 3 to the Al-Qaeda insider attack. So the U.S. military would be in a very bad way if they couldn't immediately grab National Guard guys to fill in all these different gaps and capabilities. So I think the states grabbing control of that, it gives us more power as the American people.
All right, I want you to think for a minute about what just happened. The man who, until 2 months ago, was running the Counterterrorism Center, the man whose desk had the daily threat assessment on it, just told you on camera that state-level legislation to prevent the Guard units from being deployed to undeclared wars is, and I'm quoting him directly, huge. It's not a fringe argument. It's not some weird libertarian talking point. It's the position of a man who's one of the most serious counterterrorism professionals this country has produced in a generation. And it's a position no one in his recent peer group has taken publicly. Because if you take that position, you can't stay in those rooms. You get tossed out. Joe Kent took that position and walked away. That's why I'm telling you that we should support Joe Kent. We need to find more Joe Kents. And that's why I'm telling you to support the legislation that he just told a national audience is the answer. Joe didn't walk into a fringe room in Lake Jackson last weekend. He walked into a room where his diagnosis was the consensus among the people who have been right about every major war that America has fought in the last 20 years. Now, I want to play you 2 more voices from that conference, not to pile on, but to triangulate, to show you what Joe said on the stage is not isolated. It's the consensus of the most credible non-government voices in American foreign policy in this country. First, Professor Robert Pape, the empirical scholar, the University of Chicago professor who's advised every American president since 2001. His new Substack, which is called the Escalation Trap.substack.com, I think is the address. It's also the name of the trap that he warned us about in his speech.
This is the escalation trap I write about. This is tightening. And right now, we are at a fork in the road. Either we today, and we're talking about this today, literally, escalate to take Hormuz, and countless Americans will die in the future, or we walk away, and Iran becomes the 4th center of world power. And this is what people don't like to hear on that side, and then as the 4th center of world power works with Russia and China to likely crush America's economy in other ways.
An escalation trap closes off your options the longer that you stay in it. That is what the institutional inertia around the Iran war looks like from the highest academic perch in this country. That is what walking Dan Caine over the line in February was the start of, not the end of. Now, there's another voice I want you to hear. It's Brian McGlinchey. You already heard from him earlier describing the Mossad briefing that converted Dan Caine. After his speech, I got to sit down with him for an interview as well. When I asked him about Defend the Guard specifically, what passing it in even a handful of states would actually do to a war like the one that we're in right now, here's what he said.
18 states' National Guard units are now participating in the war in Iran. 18, including my home state of Idaho, where we had A-10 pilots that were involved in the rescue of the downed F-35 weapons safety officer. Do you think that if Defend the Guard were to pass, that depriving the national military of that warm set of bodies could have any influence over this foreign intervention policy that we have?
I think it would have a tremendous influence. You take some of these vital pieces that they can plug and play when conflict is going, take those pieces off the table. I think it would really impair the ability. Not to mention the political dynamic.
Right.
You know, it's the debates and stuff that would precede that movement. Okay, we want to activate them, and you've got, you know, the controversy in the state capitol. Like, wait a minute, we can't do that. The pushback, you know, the attention that would draw, the dynamic to it. I think there's follow-on effects even beyond just the immediate effect.
Did you catch that? Defend the Guard would be a tremendous influence on this exact war. From a journalist who has spent 2 decades documenting exactly how these wars get assembled, not some weird wacko libertarian position, a structural one. Pape, he gave us the academic case. McGlinchey, he gave us the structural political case. And Joe Kent, he gave us the constitutional case from inside the executive branch. 3 voices, 3 different angles, all landing on the same conclusion. So the argument is stop depending on individual conscience to override an institutional machine. Build yourself a structural restraint at the level the institutional machine cannot reach. And folks, that level is the states. All right, there's one more witness from the Lake Jackson conference before I close. It was former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she gave a speech at the conference about why she resigned from Congress. She told the room about the day President Trump called her a traitor on social media. He did that because she released the Epstein files. He did it because she opposed Trump on Iran. He did it because she asked the questions that she'd been elected to ask. Listen to how she thought about the word traitor.
And so we released the Epstein files. And then I got a Truth Social dropped on my head like a nuclear bomb where the president called me a traitor. And I read that and I thought, a traitor? Oh my gosh. I looked up the definition of traitor. I looked it up. I was like, I have to wrap my head around this. And so a traitor is a traitor to the United States of America. And I swore an oath to defend our Constitution. And I really thought about it. I said, he's not talking about what we think of the definition of traitor. He's saying I was a traitor to him. To him. And that's why I was a traitor to him. And that's why he was going to support a primary against me, just like he's doing to Thomas Massie, which is horrific. And I looked at that and I thought to myself, this is a badge of honor. It truly is.
Like me, she swore an oath to defend the Constitution, not an oath of loyalty to a man. And when Marjorie Taylor Greene saw the President of the United States call her a traitor on Truth Social, she did exactly what I would have done in this situation. I would have looked the word up. It's too serious not to. I want to make sure I understand what it means. You see, a traitor is somebody who betrays their country. And what she figured out, and what she had the courage to say out loud on that stage in Lake Jackson, is that President Trump was not using the word that way at all. He was not saying that she had betrayed the United States of America. He was not saying that she had violated her oath to her Constitution or to her constituents. He was saying, in not so subtle terms, she betrayed him. Now that's a confession, whether Trump meant it as one or not. It tells you exactly how the man on the top of this administration thinks about loyalty. Not loyalty to your country, not loyalty to the Constitution, not loyalty to the platform that he ran on, but loyalty to him personally. And once you understand that, once you accept that that's what he means when he uses that word, you have to ask yourself a really, really hard question. Because there's a multi-factional coalition of Americans who came together across the entire political spectrum to help elect a man who is now in the White House. Conservatives, libertarians, paleocons, independents, disaffected Democrats, anti-war Republicans, old school Buchananites, America First populists, veterans of every war this country has fought in our adult lifetime. See, that coalition came together around a set of explicit, repeated public promises. No more regime change wars. No more endless wars. A real America First golden age. We believed it. We worked for it. We donated to it. We voted for it. We knocked doors for them. We brought our family and friends together. We brought them along with us. We went to rallies. And then we watched all those promises get broken. Not by us, not by Marjorie Taylor Greene, not by Joe Kent, not by anybody who left the administration to keep their oath to the Constitution. Those promises were broken by the man who made them. Now, I'm not going to use the word traitor the way that the President of the United States used it about Marjorie Taylor Greene and Joe Kent. That word's too serious and it doesn't fit. It belongs in a constitutional category. We don't throw it around lightly in our organization or on this show. But by his own definition, the definition that he used when he posted about Marjorie, somebody in this story has betrayed somebody. But the coalition, it didn't move. We're still standing exactly where we stood when he asked us for our votes. We still want no new regime change wars. We still want America first. We still want our troops to come home. We didn't change. He did. So when he says somebody in this relationship's a traitor, by the personal loyalty definition that he himself established, the title does not belong to Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm going to leave it to him to elevate himself to the dignity of the office that he holds and look at the multi-factional coalition that helped put him there and ask himself honestly which side of that broken promise he's standing on. Now, I apologize, I've digressed there. Let me come back to where this episode started. I want to come back to General Dan Caine for just one more minute, because everything I said about him in this episode is also true of every other person that you and I have ever counted on to hold the line on war. Not unique. We've counted on Pete Hegseth. He endorsed Defend the Guard before the cameras turned on. We counted on Tulsi Gabbard. Her own intelligence community testified that Iran was not building a weapon. She let her boss say, I don't care at all what Tulsi says. And she stayed in her chair. We counted on people like Senator Jim Risch, who told me on camera in front of a room of hundreds of people that he was done with nation building, but since the Iran war started, he has refused to even hold a public hearing. And now we know that we could have possibly counted on Dan Caine, but that wasn't realistic either. The man who told his wingman in 2001 that he would carry the moral weight himself was carried over that decision line by a foreign government. But this isn't a story about bad people. This is a story about a system designed to convert good people, even if it's just for a moment. And the lesson is not that we need to find better people. People are people. They're all flawed. The lesson is to stop depending on people, on individuals, to override institutional pressure. Joe Kent, he figured that out and he walked out the door. That's why his answer when I asked him on camera was defend the guard. That's why he called it huge. That's why a man with no political reason to bless a state-level reform movement blessed it anyway. Because at the federal level, the system wins always, every single time. But if we apply the right pressure at the state, the system loses. The states win, the people win. Because at the state level, every single legislator can be looked at in the eye by every single voter in their district. There's no distance between the people and where the representatives work. There's no Eyal Zamir flying into Boise, Idaho or Phoenix, Arizona to brief my state representatives. There's no Mossad agent in a situation room in Nashville, Tennessee. There's just the legislator, the voter, the Constitution, and the National Guard units. That's the leverage we actually have. And that, my friends, is the answer. So we had a story of two warriors, one system, and two vastly different endings. One stayed and got worked over by foreign officials whose loyalties are not to you and me or any American person. And one walked out the door and went to a podium in Lake Jackson and tell the American people the truth. So, I'm going to ask you to do something, right? Here's what it is. I want you to go to defendtheguard.us. Enlist in our movement. Add your name to a rapidly growing list of Americans and veterans who are demanding that Congress reclaim our constitutional war powers so that a foreign government or bad actors inside of our own government cannot influence a single person or a small handful of his closest advisors to take this nation into another war of choice. And if you can spare a few bucks, chip in, man. We need your help. Help fuel the fight to pass Defend the Guard legislation in every state in the country. And if you want to do more, and I hope you do, go to defendtheguard.us/fight for something or bringourtroopshome.us/fight for something and learn how you can become a top 1% activist with a very, very low lift action. We have built this on purpose to make it easy for you to plug in at whatever level your life allows. Finally, probably the easiest thing to do would be to like, comment, and share this episode. That's how we reach more Americans, and that's how we add to the size of our America First anti-regime change war community. And that's how the room in Lake Jackson, Texas, small and scrappy and principled and right about every war for the last 20 years, becomes the room that determines what this country does next. Two warriors. One was captured and stayed, and one remained true and walked away. We have to build a system that does not depend on which choice the next person makes. So for the Constitution and for our troops, thanks for watching the Bring Our Troops Home podcast, and we'll see you next time.